I'm here with Josie Cullen, who has our first question tonight. Answering your questions, the former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, the former Foreign Minister Bob Carr. Journalist Fran is here, the Australian's editor-at-large, Paul Kelly, and in Melbourne, historian and author of the Palace Letters, Jenny Hocking. Please make all of them feel welcome. So, Josie, what's your question?
The majority of politicians are men, and there's continual reference to the boys' club. Why is this such a hostile environment for women to enter? And how can we support and level out the playing field?
And so, just to be clear, you submitted that last week before any of us knew about this Four Corners. You have just watched it. What did you make of it?
I found it really concerning how much focus there was on, I guess, politicians engaging in affairs and that leaving them open to compromise. And it felt like there was a bit of lacking concern around the support for the women in these staffing roles and the compromise they were being left open to and the possible advantage they were being taken of and the pressure with that power imbalance.
OK, Fran, I want to turn to you first up. You've just seen that program as well. Your reaction?
I have. Oh, my reaction is keep it in your bloody pants, mate. That's my reaction. Yeah, keep it in your pants. I want to come back to your point about the issue of compromise, because I think there was a note for me in that broadcast where, you know, you were talking about, Malcolm, about the compromise that perhaps Christian Porter and Alan Tudge might have put themselves in and that it's not a good look for them. I think the bigger question here is around the women. And exactly as you said, Josie, and I'm so glad that you asked that question, well, where do they go if they feel like they need support? Is silence complicity in a situation like this? One of the other telling things for me in that broadcast, right, was this really small detail. And I'm going to place a bet that you sort of feel very similarly, but the WhatsApp group. The WhatsApp group that the Liberal women had and that they were sharing stories in. This is not new. This has been happening since the dawn of time, and I can guarantee you that every friendship group, women in various professions, every family WhatsApp group, they have got a thread about men that are creepers, men that are horny, men that are abusive, men that you need to stay away from. It is a warning call that women have had for so long, and now everybody is hearing about it.
These were consensual relationships, though, that were reported tonight. Why is this in the public interest to know about it?
Well, first of all, I mean, I think in the case of Christian Porter, he's billing himself as somebody who is a family man. Alan Tudge is the same. I don't care who you're stupping at the end of the day, right? And there are relationships that form in workplaces and they go on to become very fruitful relationships. What I care about, though, is the hypocrisy. If you are out here espousing family values and you are having an affair, then you are a hypocrite and you don't get to talk about values, as I know Alan Tudge loves to talk about.
Malcolm Turnbull, you pulled Christian Porter into your office for a meeting on the 6th of December 2017. You talked to him about this, you say he acknowledged it. Why did you then promote him on the 20th of December? Well,
look, just to be clear, Porter came to see me to talk about something else, and I had heard these reports of him being out drinking and being drunk in the company of young female staffers. I was not aware of any suggestions that it was anything more than that, and I gave him the very sensible advice that I did, and he didn't argue with me. He didn't say I wasn't there, it wasn't me or anything like that. He acknowledged that, and I assumed that he wouldn't do it again.
But I wasn't... But to be fair, on Four Corners, you said the reason you had to have this conversation was because he might be compromised, that Canberra was a city of spies, not all of them are on our side. Doing this sort of thing might compromise him.
Potentially, yes, potentially it could. Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think it was my... look, I'm not... I wasn't trying to be censorious about it. It is, you have a lot of personal conversations as Prime Minister. I mean, you're kind of like, in some respects, generally your office deal with a lot of these issues, but sometimes there are conversations that only the PM can have, and that was one of them. And basically, my advice to him was, this sort of thing must never happen again. Now, there's a lot of stuff about Christian Porter in that program that I did not know at the time, and frankly, I didn't know until tonight. So it is, you know, but from my point of view, ministers should behave themselves, you know, decorously when they're in public. And I mean, you know, Jan makes a point about people, you know, being able to have their private lives as they wish, and I think there's a lot to be said for that. The only point I made was that they should not have sexual relations with their staff. That has been, you know, out of order in the private sector for, as I said in the program, I would say for at least 20, probably 25 years, if not longer.
Can I just make a quick point on that? Because, you know, you had been aware of some of the allegations about Christian Porter and some of the stuff that he might have been involved with.
Well, that's actually not right. I mean, I don't want to sound, I don't want to sound like I wasn't paying attention, but when you're Prime Minister of Australia, you are very focused on running the country, right?
But the question around why you promoted him, I think, speaks to a bigger issue around the culture, right?
You think I was too forgiving?
I think you were too forgiving, and I think this is the problem that, yeah, I do.
I've had a reputation for being too forgiving.
Well, I mean, that's a diplomatic way of putting it, though, as well, because I think what a lot of women really care about and really, you know is happening is that it's not just the men that might behave inappropriately, but it's all of the padding around them that allows them to be elevated further and further up the power chain. And I think everybody's got to look at themselves and ask, OK, well, how am I enabling that? How am I supporting that? What am I doing in this instance, even though you're not the person that might have...
Jan, I think that's fair criticism. I think that is fair criticism. At the time, you know, I was aware of there having been an incident that had, you know, got a bit of notoriety. You know, I had the impression that, you know, he was drinking too much, again, that he wouldn't be Robinson Crusoe in Canberra in that regard. And so I gave him some fatherly or avuncular advice, which he accepted, didn't argue with me. But you may be right, maybe I was too forgiving.
I think we just need to be specific about this. Was it a mistake to appoint him to a position where he had oversight of the Independent National Security Legislation Monitor, the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security, and that he would sit on the National Security Committee?
Well, look, I don't think so. Obviously didn't think so at the time. I treated it as though it was a misjudgment, an error. You know, he'd done the wrong thing. He'd been injudicious, whatever you want to call it. But you know, there's a lot of stuff in the program tonight about patterns of conduct that I wasn't aware of. So it is, you know, that you really. I mean, Jan's making a point that I, you know, may well have been too forgiving. I think certainly if I'd known at the time...
I think the point is that
if I'd known at the time what was broadcast tonight, I would have made further inquiries before I made him Attorney General. I think that's true.
The truth is this is not unique to one side of politics, this sort of culture, is it?
Well, let's look at a couple of underlying principles here, beyond the two cases of ministers taken apart on the program. I think the first principle is one that's got to be absolutely adhered to and insisted on, and I'd be extremely disappointed if it weren't being adhered to in Canberra or in any other parliament, and that is that women should not feel harassed or oppressed to deliver sexually for male bosses. That's the key principle.
Yep.
And there's too much of that in the past in Australian workplace cultures, and I think it's fair to say the Four Corners program didn't say that was the case with these two affairs where women spoke out, but I would like to think that we have moved beyond that in the workplace culture in a Parliament House. That's the first principle. And we ought to make sure that our anti-discrimination laws see that women, including young, vulnerable women, especially maybe in their first job in a minister's office, never feel they can be harassed by a sort of Roger Ailes figure, if you think of the loudest voice, that great encapsulation of how awful and oppressive these bosses have been in the past. So I think that's the first principle.
Paul Kelly, are you concerned, like I am, at how politically biased the Australian newspaper and other News Corp media outlets in Australia have become? with their minimisation of critical issues such as climate change and their unwillingness to hold Conservative governments to account? And to the wider panel, do you support Kevin Rudd's call for a Royal Commission into media ownership in Australia?
Paul Kelly to start.
Well, there won't be a Royal Commission because neither the Labor Party nor the Morrison government supports it. I think we need to be very careful about proposals being put up by former Prime Ministers who carry deep grievances. They had the chance to do things when they were in office. They didn't do them. And frankly, a Royal Commission is not the best way of addressing the issue here. Now, if we're talking about media concentration, and we do tend to talk about media concentration, well, we've got a big problem. The big problem is the tech giants, the high-tech giants, Google and Facebook in particular. Surveys show that people are now getting more political information from the tech giants than they are from established media.
Paul, I
there is a
just want to
problem.
take you back to Carol's question, though. It was addressed to you. Are you concerned at how politically biased the Australian newspaper and other news media outlets have become? Are you concerned?
Well, what I'd say about this is that there is a problem of fairness in the Australian media, OK? Now, no paper is perfectly fair, all right? I mean, if we look at the New York Times, when was the last time the New York Times supported a Republican to be president? 1956, 64 years ago, OK? So if we're looking at the media in this country, well, one of the realities about the media is the business model of every media organisation, every media outlet has a built-in political constituency. And so this is part of the political polarisation we see in the country at the moment. So whether we're talking about the ABC or the Australian or the Sydney Morning Herald or the Melbourne Age or the Daily Telegraph, they play to a particular political constituency. Now, if we want to have a debate about media bias and fairness in the media, I'm quite happy to do that. But if you only want to have a debate...
You think they're all as biased as each other, is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying that at all. They're biased in different ways. But what I'm saying is, if we want to have a debate, you don't say, you're the problem, I'll have a debate about your particular company and I'm not going to worry about anyone else. That is not the reality of the media landscape. So bias is very much in the perception of the beholder. I think we should have a more considered debate about this. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But this is not just about one corporation. Kevin and Malcolm would like us to think it's just about one corporation. The truth is, it isn't.
Well, I don't think it's fair, Paul. I think your employers, the Murdoch media, has gone from being a news organisations that at election times tended to lean more to the right than the left, to become pure propaganda. I mean, the campaign on climate denial is just staggering and has done enormous damage to the world, to the global need to address global warming. I mean, it is so horrifically biased and such propaganda that Rupert's own son James can't stomach it. So he is not, he's not a dangerous lefty, he's not a sort of a grumpy old ex-Prime Minister. He is the son of the proprietor, and he has walked away and said, this is just bias. And you know it's true as well as I do. You know that the newspaper that you edited used to be a broadsheet that tended more often than not to lean to the right at editorial times, but is now undiluted propaganda. And if you want to see its embodiment and the consequences, look at Fox News and the United States today.
OK, Malcolm, no, hang on, just on this point. OK, so we have many publications that are dedicated to promoting the cause of climate change and radical action on climate change. So that's OK, is it? It's OK to be a propagandist for one side, but if one is a critic or sceptic about some of these issues, that's not OK.
And so what you've just disclosed is the fundamental problem that the company you work for and its friends in politics like Trump and others have turned this issue of physics into an issue of values or identity. Now, saying that you believe or disbelieve in global warming is like saying you believe or disbelieve in gravity. You've turned something that should be a question of engineering and economics into undiluted ideology and idiocy, and we are paying the price in delayed action to address global warming. And your employer, Paul, has got a huge share of the blame for this. It is a shocking legacy.
Now, listen, I don't think it's correct to say that the votes cast at recent elections, where the party that had the more radical and proactive stance in terms of taking action on climate change, that they were beaten, and those parties have been beaten, and this is essentially because of News Corporation, OK? I think you exaggerate the impact that we have.
That's what Rupert always used to say to me. He'd say, oh, we don't have a very big audience, we're not that influential. Talk to Lachlan. Look, I've had all of that flannel for years. The reality is News Corp and Murdoch have done enormous damage to Western democracy, and in particular to the United States and Australia, and in particular on the subject of global warming. You know, we had 12 million hectares of our country burnt last summer, and your newspapers were saying it was all the consequence of some arsonists. And James Murdoch was so disgusted, he dissociated himself from the family business. Now, what does that tell you? How offensive, how biased, how destructive does it have to be, Paul, before you will say, one of our greatest writers and journalists, it's enough, I'm out of it? I mean, how long will you keep apologising?
How dare you? Malcolm, how dare you start telling me what I should do in terms of my career?
I'm asking you to speak up.
And lecture me about what moral position I should take.
How dare I do it? I dare to do it. And I'm saying to you, Paul, it is about time that people that work for the Murdoch organisation speak up and say publicly what they say privately. Speak up and do what James Murdoch had the courage to do, and clearly too many of the employees do not.
Well,
I'll
just say one thing about this. Your problem was with the right wing of the Liberal Party. At the end of the day, you failed to manage it properly. Now, I understand you're being upset about our company, but essentially what you're doing is you're transferring your own political failures and you're wishing to blame our company for them.
I'm just going to give Jan Fran a final thought.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Can I just speak to your point about speaking up, Malcolm?
Yep.
This can be a difficult topic to talk about, and I have, you know, friends who are journalists and friends who are in public life, and we have conversations about this stuff privately, but they will not go on the record and say this publicly.
Yeah,
and the main reason is that they are scared.
Yep,
they are
correct.
scared that the Murdoch press, and I want to acknowledge it's not a homogenous entity, but they're scared that the Murdoch press is going to go after them, engage in a smear campaign, eviscerate their reputations, and they don't want to do that. And if you don't think that that happens, just look at what the Murdoch press did to Yasmin Abdul-Majid. 100,000 words in 1 year were written about that woman. 100,000 words. They hounded her out of the country. Now, let me tell you, it's one thing to do it to you, Malcolm. You are a former Prime Minister, as is Kevin Rudd. You have... I heard you're quite rich. You've got the money to deal with it. You've got the time. You've got the connections. You've got the platforms. Somebody like Yasmin doesn't. And people, and it's women, usually women of colour, who speak up and who say something that perhaps journalists in the Murdoch press don't necessarily agree with, and they get targeted. And you know what? I don't want a pig's head being sent to my high school. I don't want to have to deal with hundreds, if not thousands, of rape and death threats. I don't want a white supremacist organisation to post my picture on walls around the city calling for my deportation. I don't want commentators going on the radio telling everybody how they'd like to run me over with their car. And all of that happened to Yasmin. And that happened in large part because of the relentless and the cruel and unnecessary smear campaign that was targeted at her by the Murdoch press. Now, you tell me who wants that.
Does the panel believe Senator Erica Betts' unprompted demand that I and two other Chinese Australians condemn the Chinese Communist Party is acceptable behaviour from a senator?
Just help us with a bit of context here. You went and appeared in Parliament. Just explain what happened.
So I appeared in front of the Senate inquiry into issues facing diaspora communities last month. I went there to give some evidence about diversity in politics. One of my big views is that Australia is a great multicultural country, but unfortunately our institutions such as Parliament don't reflect that diversity. I expected a few tough questions, but what I did not expect was a demand from Senator Abetz that was made to myself and to other Chinese Australians who made separate submissions on different topics that we condemn the Chinese Communist Party. Effectively, it felt like a demeaning public loyalty test.
Okay, Jan Fran.
The question, was it acceptable? No. That's the short answer to that. Long answer is shit no. It definitely was not acceptable for you to be asked that question in front of a Senate committee by Eric Abetz. Because ultimately, what that is actually saying, and I'm of Lebanese descent, and I think that many Australians of non-Anglo descent would probably feel the same about this. It is just a confirmation that you actually are not really Australian, that you are here conditionally and that you are here on a good behaviour bond. And you need to constantly,
Look, can I just say...
Hang on, one second.
Go on.
And that you need to be constantly proving your loyalty to this country. That is not asked of other people. Now, I read the transcript, and Eric Abetz in that exchange said to you, actually, that is asked of other people. He said, sadly, if you are of Italian descent, you'll be asked if you're part of the mafia. If you're of Vietnamese descent, you'll be asked if you're part of a triad. If you're of German descent, as he is, you'll be asked if you're a fascist. This is rubbish. When was the last time you have ever heard in a Senate committee, apropos of nothing, an Italian being asked whether or not they have links to the mafia? When have you heard that? You haven't. But you know what the most telling word in that whole exchange was for me, Osman? Was the word sadly. Sadly, if you are of Italian descent, you will be asked if you're part of the mafioso. Eric Abetz knows that that is actually sad. That is not a thing that is okay to do, but he does it anyway, and he couches it as some kind of homage to Australian values when it's not about values, it's about race, and it's not okay.
Osman, how did the whole experience make you feel?
The experience was surreal. I don't think I've ever felt singled out on the basis of my cultural background in that way. So I'm an Australian. My family's been here for 50 years. My family has never lived in the People's Republic of China. And like this, I've also appeared before Senate committees previously, and I've never been treated like this by any senator, regardless of their party.
Jenny Hocking, what do you make of it?
Oh, it's just appalling. I think what Osman has faced is shocking, and I think Senator Abetz owes him and his colleagues an enormous apology. No one should have to account for their background or their response, their commitment to Australia in that public way that Senator Abetz did, and it just should never happen. And particularly the context of the Senate committee hearing, it's almost it's quite surreal, as often said.
Jenny, time and time again this year on this program, we've received questions from Australians of Chinese descent or Asian descent talking about how all of this heightened political rhetoric around China is changing their experience of being Australian. Do you acknowledge that? Do you see that? Do you believe that?
Oh, well, of course. That's because we've had such a heavy-handed, and as Bob Carr said, have lacked the skillful diplomacy needed to deal with China at the moment, and it's left Chinese Australians of that background feeling very much a part of a broader racist increase within Australia, and that's a very poor thing. And this ought to be dealt with better on the international level.
Hamish, one very quick thought here: that the experience of the three Australians of Chinese background before that Senate committee reminded me of something else that was vivid, I think, for all of us, that revealed the ethnic antagonism that is the darker side of Australia's personality. It reminded me, of all things, of the treatment that Adam Goodes received on the football field. When again you saw the dark side of Australia's personality activated in the abuse directed at him. There he was, the young man from a difficult background with a real narrative of Indigenous Australia, doing great things on the sporting field, and this hateful expression, these hateful expressions that were flung at him from parts of the crowd. I thought of that when I read the account of what our bets directed at you. It was activating an ethnic antagonism in the context of someone behaving as a tin pot Joe McCarthy. And one thing that was put to Joe McCarthy that brought him to a halt was one of the people being interrogated by him saying to him, "Have you no decency, sir? Have you no decency?"
Right.
Can I just make
Very
one thing?
quickly, Malcolm,
very
please.
quickly, Osman, what was said to you is disgraceful. I agree with everything that was said, particularly Jan Fran's very eloquent and pithy denunciation of it. It was a surreal experience, can I tell you, having known Eric Abetz for a long time. Surreal is often the adjective that you apply to encounters with him. He is right on the fringe of the Liberal Party. He's a sensationalist. He does not represent the attitudes or views of the Liberal Party at large.
apologise to these three?
Of course, Eric Abetz absolutely should apologise to Osman, but let me tell you, he never will.